Dear ladies and gentlemen, пані та панове, here we are after Christmas break with episode number 38 of our series of conversation and interviews with intellectuals in Ukraine and abroad. For those out there who are keen to learn more, think deeper, and hear from the original sources. І ми знову з вами після різдвяної паузи з 38-м випуском нашої серії розмов та інтерв'ю з інтелектуалами в Україні та за кордоном. Для тих, хто хоче дізнатися більше, думати глибше та чути з першого джерела. This is a project of Pan-Ukraine, whose team is continuing their work under the extremely difficult conditions of Russian continuing war against Ukraine. During our break, Ukraine survived the attacks on residential buildings in Dnipro, Kremenchuk, yesterday Kramatorsk. Ukrainians welcome New Year under one of the most intensive shelling. Territory of all the country was attacked. Nevertheless, all the services are recovering and center work in their full capacity, what is unbelievable. Це проєкт «Пан Україна», вся команда якого продовжує свою роботу в надзвичайно складних умовах триваючої війни Росії проти України. За час нашої перерви багато що відбулося. Україна пережила обстріли житлових будинків у Дніпрі, Кременчуці, вчора Краматорську. Новий рік українці зустрічали під одним з найінтенсивніших обстрілів. Було атаковано практично всю територію України. Тим не менш, робота усіх служб відновлюється, а центр працює на повну потужність, що просто неймовірно. The project is co-hosted by Pan International, which has continued to provide a platform for freedom of expression for those currently under the highest risk. The project is implemented with the support of the US Embassy in Ukraine and our traditional partners, Pan America, the Ukrainian Institute London, Ukraine World, Local History, Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, Ukraine World, the Harman Institute at Columbia University. We stream today's event to all partners' Facebook pages. Співорганізатором проєкту є Міжнародний ПЕН, який продовжує надавати платформу для свободи вираження поглядів тим, хто перебуває у групі найвищого ризику. Нагадаю, що проект втілюється за підтримки Посольства США в Україні. І нашими традиційними партнерами є Пан Америка, Український інститут Лондона, Україна Світ, Вокальна історія, Український науково-дослідний інститут Гарвардського університету та інститут Гаррімана при Колумбійському університеті. Ми стрімимо сьогоднішню подію на всі партнерські сторінки у Facebook. Захід відбуватиметься англійською мовою. And I will switch into English to introduce my guests. My name is Olha Mukha and I work for Pan International and I'm delighted to introduce who is visiting us today. Maria Tomak, Ukrainian human rights activist, journalist, researcher, coordinator, and co-founder of the Media Initiative of Human Rights. Having started from volunteering for Euromaidan Souls initiative during Euromaidan, Maria moved on to actively participate in documenting human rights violation in eastern Ukraine and Russia's sector of Crimea, and delivering this information then both in Ukrainian society and the international community. In the summer of 2014, Maria started dealing with the cases of Ukrainian citizens arrested by Russian Federation on political motives by Russia, and further was a coordinator of the Let My People Go campaign, you probably heard of it, to free them, including by participating in the court hearing in Chechnya as one of the witnesses of the defense in Ukrainian prisoners. Today, Maria focuses on cooperating with Ukrainian structures to advocate for the release of Ukrainian illegally held by Russia. Plenty of them. As well, she is co-author of several documentaries dedicated to the bloodiest days of Euromaidan and the war in Donbass. In 2017, she received a National Human Rights Prize for the personal contribution to the defending of human rights in Ukraine. So she has significant experience in international advocacy at both level of international and intergovernmental and particular governments. In January 2022, straight before the full invasion, Maria shifted from NGO to the governmental sector. Currently, she is the head of the Crimea Platform Department at the mission of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, which acts at the national office in the Crimea Platform. And she will hold her conversation. Thank you for joining us today, Maria. We know how busy you are with all those tasks. And she will talk to Christina Lamb, who is our British guest today. is chief foreign correspondent at the Sunday Times and one of Britain's leading foreign journalists as well as best-selling author. She has reported from most of the world's hotspots, most recently Ukraine. And I believe you are going there, yes, soon.
Yes.
But starting with Afghanistan after an unexpected vetting invitation, this is a very interesting fact. Unexpected vetting invitation led her to Karachi in 1987 when she was just 21. Her dispatches with a Mujahideen fighting the Soviet Union saw her named Young Journalist of the Year. Since then, she has been awarded Foreign Correspondent of the Year 6 times, as well as Europe Top War Reporting Prize, the Prix Faya, and was recently given the prestigious Lifetime Achievement Award by a Society of Editors. Christina has written 10 books, and I bet you read at least one of those. Farewell Kabul, The Africa House, The Sewing Circles of Harriet, and co-wrote the international bestseller I Am Malala with Malala herself, and The Girl from Aleppo with Nurjin Mustafa, and the latest one, The Prince Rupert Hotel for the Homeless, the very first about Britain. She has always particularly focused on what happened to women in war and collected accounts of sexual violence in conflict from all over the world for her recent book, Our Bodies, Their Battlefield, which I had such a pleasure to moderate a presentation in Berlin recently. It will be published in Ukraine this year with a special prologue from Ukraine. Horrible, but beautiful book. Highly recommended. So let's focus on Ukraine and the new insights from those two who have a lot to say. You have 45 minutes, ladies, and the stage is yours. And our listeners and viewers, you are absolutely welcome to ask your questions in the comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here from London. Nice to see you again, Olha. And thank you to PEN International for hosting this. I think it's a great idea. So I've got so many questions I'd like to ask you, Maria. But perhaps to start with, I could just ask you, where are you and how is the situation where you are at the moment?
Thank you. And let me also start by saying thank you to organizers and thank you for having me here. And it's a great pleasure to talk to you, Christina, given your experience, which is remarkable, and the fact that you're reporting on Ukraine as well. So I'm currently in Kyiv. Our institution is located in Kyiv. When the full-scale invasion started, it catched us, so to say, in Lviv. We had a working trip there, but we were back to Kyiv in 1.5 months. Since there, I stay here. But actually, our institution should be in Crimea, but now it's impossible because of the occupation, essentially. But I really hope that we can go there in the nearest time. That's our hope, and that's what we are working for, essentially. So now the situation in Kyiv is not as bad. I mean, the situation with electricity is more stable, although it depends, and we just discussed with the colleagues prior to this stream that the situation differs from city to city in Ukraine. And of course, the closer you get to the Russian occupied territories or to Russia, it's getting worse, basically. But I mean, when you ask me where am I and how the situation is here, I also think about Crimea, of course, because although we're located in Kyiv physically, but we work on Crimea on day-to-day basis. And of course, the role of the territory of Crimea in the current situation is very dramatic, I would say, because of the fact that it was occupied by Russia in 2014. It was turned throughout all these years into a military base, into an isolated place, and it dramatically served as a springboard for this large-scale attack. And unfortunately now, when we talk prior to the anniversary of this dramatic, sad anniversary of the full-scale invasion, There's talks all over the place about another probable massive Russian attack on Ukraine mainland, which might happen in February. We can already see the escalation in the eastern part of Ukraine, and an escalation, although all the time you will understand that rocket attacks and fightings are ongoing, but still more weapons, more military personnel, more military vehicles. So, and another large-scale attacks, rocket attacks on Ukraine might happen, as well as another attack on Kiev might happen. So that's the backdrop of everything. But somehow we got used even to this. We got used to the war throughout 8 years since the war had started. It was not so obvious for every single citizen in this country, but now it's too obvious, and everyone feels that. Every single person in this country is affected by the war, basically, either directly or indirectly. But that's how we probably learn to live. But nevertheless, we hope and we working for this war to be over as soon as possible.
One of the things I always find most interesting in reporting on war is I don't like the fighting, not the actual bang bang, as we call it, but how people live during a war, because there are millions of people still trying to live, still, going to work, bringing up their children, looking after the elderly. Often that's the women doing that. And one of the things I found so striking coming to Ukraine was the resilience of people. And it's quite unnerving when you arrive and you hear the air raid sirens going off. And most people are just carrying on with everything. They just got used to it. And I wondered for you, what has been the hardest moment for you of this war?
Probably because, as our previous speaker was telling, Ms. Mukha, I used to work as a human rights defender for a long time. And to some extent also as a journalist, as a reporter, as a researcher. So maybe the most complicated thing is that when you find yourself not an observer, but a victim of the war. I was not affected directly. I was not wounded or something, but suddenly you realize that because prior to full-scale invasion, you could literally go to a war, for instance, in eastern Ukraine, and then you could go back to your safe or relatively safe place. And just to remind yourself that there's still war in your country, that you should do something about that, but still you had a safe place. Now it seems like you don't have this safe place, and you are already kind of becoming not an observer, but you are like a part of this traumatized community in this country. So, and that's, of course, something that brings you this feeling of being insecure. But I believe that that's something maybe that's the point where I can also maybe ask you a question, because just now when we met online, the first vibe that I get, that you're really positive, extremely positive person. And I'm just wondering how you manage to stay such a positive person after everything you've seen as a reporter and that you've survived. Because at some point after even the war has started, this issue of burning out became an important topic for Ukrainian human rights defenders and journalists. I think in 2018, people started to notice that, it really affects them, even though, they just observe, they just question people, they just go from time to time to a front line, but that affects you. So how do you manage to to preserve your mental health, and if it's possible at all?
It's a very good question. And I mean, you're right. It's going to become a bigger and bigger issue as the war goes on, that, you're going to have a very traumatized population. And I think for me, I mean, it's a little different because it's not my country that's at war, and I've never, I can always fly away. So that is quite different, although I have spent a lot of time in some places, particularly Afghanistan. But I think what keeps me positive is actually that what I go to really bad places. I see people doing terrible things, but I also see incredible heroism of people, ordinary people, the spirit of people in these awful situations. I remember being in Aleppo, in the old city, which had been pulverized by the Russians. And there were all these people still trying to live there with no power, no water. It was freezing cold. And, seeing the women pulling down bits of window frame and door frame to burn for heat, making pancakes for the children from just flour and any little bit of green vegetation they could find. And so seeing people doing that, and really, incredible human spirit in those most difficult situations, I think actually makes you more positive. I mean, from what I've seen, it makes me feel that actually we can survive really, really bad situations. We are probably all stronger than we think we are. I guess when the pandemic started, everybody here in the UK, as in all countries, people were scared because you felt like you could catch this thing from touching door handles, that if people came near you, nobody knew how life would be. But we got used to it pretty quickly, and how to deal with it. And so I think that the fact that I've met some really inspiring people, I do think they tend to be women, but maybe it's because I'm a woman and I talk to women more. But people I've worked with, like Malala, for example, the girl in Pakistan who was shot by the Taliban and has become an activist for education all over the world. She was just an ordinary girl. She wasn't, anything special. She'll be the first to say that there are sort of thousands of Malalas all over the world. But, she did speak up, and she says one girl, one book, one teacher can change the world. And I think I see that a lot, that actually people can do more than they think they can. And unfortunately, in a war is when you get really tested. But I think all of the people that I was meeting in Ukraine, in Kharkiv, in places where they were, volunteering, making food, taking it to elderly people in places that were being heavily bombed, those were ordinary, often, housewives who probably would never have imagined themselves doing something like that. And yet they were showing incredible bravery. So I think it actually does make you just much more positive. But I'd be the first to say, I don't think war resolves anything. I wish there was no war anywhere. And I never set out to cover war. I'm also interested to hear from you, because you were a journalist and then you moved to being an activist and now part of the administration. How has that adjustment been? What has made you do that?
Well, thank you. And just let me reflect on something that you were saying, because absolutely. I mean, the Malala story, it impressed, I think, lots of people here in Ukraine, and your book was translated some years ago. I think it was in 2019 and 2018 even. And when I was preparing to our conversation, I didn't read your book, I have to be honest, previously, but I thought that I have to do this. And it was really challenging to find this book. So I bought it I bought a used one on OLX platform, and it was a challenge to find it, which I think it's a good sign that people really felt interested in it. And that heroism of ordinary people, I think that we in Ukraine have witnessed it since the revolution in 2014 at least, right? So that was also such a heroism of ordinary people who were not afraid of the police violence. And then we've seen it also starting from when the war actually started in many occasions, and especially obvious it is now. And because I think it's important to include Crimea in this general picture. Now what we see there is that many people who are not, so to say, professional activists, who are not working for some NGOs or whatever, because now it's impossible in Russian-controlled areas and occupied territories. But I mean, lots of people are just protesting against the full-scale invasion, against this violence that is committed in the mainland Ukraine by various means. Some women, they just wear blue and yellow manicure, and that's how they got persecuted for discrediting of the Russian army. Or some people use Molotov cocktails, but some, launch some WhatsApp groups about the war, and that's how they end up persecuted again. So, and we see hundreds of cases like that in Crimea now, all over the peninsula, and that's what makes me very optimistic about the future of Crimea, and that's what makes me really curious about, for instance, when sometimes we read in the media that there will be, once Ukraine will try to gain back control over Crimea, there will be a pro-Russian partisan movement or something like this, and I'm just wondering where the hell people get this feeling, because I mean, I don't have it.
It's really interesting because, we don't get much information from what's happening in Crimea. So do you talk to a lot of people there?
I mean, I'm proud to say that we are the institution which remains the closest to Crimea of all the Ukrainian state institutions. And because lots of our, not lots, but the part of our team is essentially from the human rights movement, from the NGO movement, and that's been our kind of essence throughout the years. So we've been in touch with the field, and that remains very important for us till now, to understand what are the concerns and what are people thinking there, and how can we help, because it's really challenging. It's especially now when the full-scale invasion started, and those small opportunities to interact with the occupied territories is even more complicated. But that's something maybe that brings me to the answer to your question, because I think that may sound a bit provocative, but I think that now in Ukraine, after the start of this full-scale invasion, especially, to become a civil servant is the new black, if I may say so, because, I mean, I don't underestimate, because we work a lot with NGOs generally, and I think that it's not less important. But I also think that it's so important now for Ukraine, for Ukrainians, to take responsibility for our state on ourselves, because throughout our history of being colonized by Moscow in one iteration or another, there's been this sentiment, which is, I think, widely recognized by Ukrainians by themselves, that we don't like a state because it has always been so repressive, so oppressive, and Ukrainians used to fight a state. But now it's really time when we need to do that and there's no other alternative. And just yesterday we had an interesting conversation with sociologists who made a poll on various aspects of the post-conflict, post-war Ukrainian future. And what is I'm just wondering whether it will be something surprising for you, because it appeared to be that 20% of those who were questioned, and there was plenty of people, by the way, so it wasn't so marginal poll, but it was a real good one in the government-controlled areas, but still, so 20% of people see that after the war, Ukraine should become one of the leaders in Central Europe. And I found it interesting because, you would not expect from the country, which is heavily shelled by the so-called Second Army, whose infrastructure is very much damaged. Like several cities are totally destroyed in the eastern Ukraine when there are lots of the resources in terms of our economy. So you have so many people who are IDPs. You have such a great human potential that is, maybe it's lost because people left. But still somehow, and I think that has to do with the perception of this war in the minds of people, we still perceive this war as an anti-colonial war that will help us to get rid of something, some bury, so to say. And that just amazed me. And I'm just wondering, maybe it's just my perception that it feels strange to me. And somehow that wonders me that every fifth person in this country thinks that after this war, Ukraine will become a leader. So that's somehow is interesting. And that's also interlinked with the fact why I think people feel optimistic. And I think that more and more people will be willing to join even the state institution, because there's no other way that we can change the country. And it's not always good, to be a part of the state now, because we still have lots of people who are really corrupted. You have these corruption scandals all over the place and all over the time. And once you join the state institution, I can be very honest with you, the attitude of some of your former colleagues immediately becomes negative towards you, although you did not do anything. But it's immediately, and to some extent it's okay and it's good, because civil society has to be critical always. But I think that also we need more and more people in the state, because otherwise this dream of every fifth person in the country that we're somehow becoming more potential, we have more potential, these dreams will not come true.
It doesn't surprise me that much, that figure, because, Ukraine now has become such a, the name, everybody knows Ukraine, the colors, so many people here in the UK, have got Ukrainian flags or, wear Ukrainian colors. And so, it has, I don't know, quite like a brand almost that it will be very powerful, I think, in the future. It stands for something, for standing up to Russian aggression. For we all feel that you're fighting this for us, right? If you were to lose, where would the Russians go next? But I do wonder, you must have seen in discussion about how this will end and talk about, possible peace negotiations in the future, that many people talk about leaving Crimea as part of Russia, as part of the deal. And you've even had the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, the other day talking about, that there's no way that Ukraine could sort of take back all its territory. How do you feel about that?
Oh, yes, that's a complicated conversation. And what I've noticed is that you could barely found any publications on Crimea in international media prior to the full-scale invasion or in the beginning of the full-scale invasion. But now, especially after Kherson was liberated by Ukraine, everyone not everyone, but those people who were skeptics about possibilities of Ukraine started to understand that Ukraine at some point may want to deoccupy Crimea or may try to deoccupy Crimea. We have seen lots of publications all over the place, and lots of them were saying like, okay, Ukraine should stay away from Crimea. And, you know, I mean, it's, I'm afraid that it would take too long to, you know, to get to all of the details. But I think it has to do also with the genuine belief of many people that Crimea has, quote unquote, has always been Russian. And this is, if you think about that deeply, I mean, this has to do also with the understanding or imagination or perception of Crimea in terms how Moscow were projecting what Crimea is. And somehow, even the West, I mean, in general, it absorbed the perception of Crimea, which was produced by Russia itself. And because if you look at the history of Crimea, and by the way, I really want to advertise here Professor Rory Finnin, who works in Cambridge and who is the head of Ukrainian studies in Cambridge, and who studies Crimea as historian. And he recently wrote an excellent piece in Politico, for instance, about what Crimea is. And so Crimea, actually, there were lots of Crimean Tatars living there. It's the indigenous people of Crimea, and there were up to 90% of the population prior to the first annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation. And there's almost no kind of this sort of perception about Crimea, but usually what you get is this perception as the Russian peninsula, of the Russian wartime glory, etc., etc. So it's quite imperial, I would say, quite colonial. And this perception of Crimea, it also requires decolonization. And, you know, and at some point also, it's interesting because recently we had a working trip to Turkey. For Turkey, Crimea is also a special geographical location, so to say. And at some point, while we had lots of meetings with our Turkish kind of colleagues and some other people, I realized that as much as Crimea, the perception of Crimea is formed by the Russian imperial thinking for Russian Federation, but also for the West. At the same time, perception of Crimea in Turkey was formed by the, you know, Ottoman Empire times. And it's very interesting because this perception is totally different. And it is perceived in terms of the presence of the Turkic people in Crimea, right? And the deportation of Crimean Tatars. So that is very interesting. And I think that for us, it's a challenge, and it's not only about, you know, academic perception of Crimea, because I can see every day, literally, when we work, that this perception is translated into policies, into how what decisions are taken. And those debates around Crimea now and around whether the West should provide Ukraine with the weapons that can help Ukraine to liberate Crimea are actually shaped by those narratives and perception of Crimea. And I think that that's why this initiative of Ukraine Crimea platform is important, because lots of people, lots of governors, parliamentarians used to come there and saying like, Crimea is a part of Ukraine. Crimea is, should be respect to territorial integrity of Ukraine. But now, you know, many people might find themselves caught in the situation when they have implement those words into action, which might be quite uncomfortable, because sometimes I have a feeling when lots of those, people who spoke within the events of the Crimea platform, they could not even imagine that it might happen so soon, so that Crimea, will become a part of this debate on and can be liberated in the occupied in the nearest time. So. I think that Crimea is to the large extent underestimated, and it should be rediscovered, so to say, and
Of course, for us here, I mean, we all learn about the Crimean War at school, the Crimean War that the UK was involved in because of Florence Nightingale being, that's where she did her nursing famously at the Lamp. But so I'm not sure that people accept the Russian narrative at all. I mean, I think in the West, everyone feels quite clearly that it was occupied and annexed illegally by Russia. And, there's a lot of kind of schadenfreude now about why nothing was done at the time, which, things might have been very different. I mean, actually, we all reacted outside, at least, with great shock at what Russia has done in Ukraine. But then sometimes I look back and think, as a journalist, I've been covering some of these things that Russia has been doing in other places. Syria, for example, there's no way that Assad would still be in power, in my view, if the Russians hadn't sent their air force and propped him up. And yet we never put all these things together. Now you can look back and see that there was a very clear trajectory of what he was trying to do, and that there were various points the West could have done things and didn't. And he obviously, assumed that the West, I guess, wasn't going to do anything this time. And I personally feel quite strongly that what happened in Afghanistan was very linked to this, that seeing the complete shameful, actually, collapse of NATO in Afghanistan, the way that they've just abandoned Afghans to life under the Taliban, pretty much, that Putin must have thought that we would not do anything if he then went into Ukraine. And he must have been absolutely shocked to have seen the resolve of NATO to do something. I know it's not as much as people in Ukraine would like, but it's sort of getting there bit by bit. And, there has been tremendous unity.
And also, I mean, I really also want to talk with you because given your extensive experience, now for Ukraine, it's very important. We kind of trying and starting to open for ourselves, not only the Western countries, which obviously remains a key priority for us in terms of integration into the EU and transatlantic community, but also we try to start to talk with the countries of the global South. And you worked a lot in those countries. And I don't want, again, to sound kind of colonial or something, because we're talking with, Ukrainian, with the British person, but still, since you worked a lot there and you know the narratives and how people think there. And I'm just wondering how we can talk about our war with people in the global South, let's say in those countries and those communities where you have worked. Because, of course, this war is really impressive and depressive for our partners in the West, but I don't think that is something that we can discuss with, let's say, survivors from Taliban
No, well, I've just come back from Southern Africa, South Africa and Zimbabwe, and of course the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has been on tour there this week, trying to drum up support And unfortunately, a lot of the countries do, or at the very least, are ambivalent about what's happening, but don't support the West because many of them are anti-Western and anti-colonial. And so, ironically, you're talking about to you, Russia is the colonial power. To them, they see Russia as standing up against the West, and that's somehow something that they think is something good. And so we've, seen a number of, I spent a lot of time in Pakistan. The Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, was the first person to go to Russia after the invasion. And also Afghanistan is interesting because you would think they would support you and be anti-Russian, given that they were under Soviet occupation for 10 years, not very long ago. It's where I started off covering war and conflicts in the late 80s. And yet, actually, now Russia is sort of one of the countries that they are closer to. Again, I think it's that whole thing, my enemy's enemy is my friend. So they see Russia and Iran as standing up against the West. So that's to them that they support. So I'm not sure. It's not so easy for you to do anything because there is such a sort of anti-Western feeling in many of these countries that you're now associated with that because of the support from the West. I'm sorry to see countries like South Africa, who really know about oppression, and India. So South Africa is actually doing military exercises with Russia. See countries like India not standing up against Russia here. So it is a problem. I talk about surprise at the amount of support that there has been, but actually, as you say, there is a whole huge amount of the world that is not involving themselves and actually possibly even supporting Russia here. And I think it's difficult and it's sad because in many of those countries they should be aligning with those who are being attacked by an outside would-be power.
And how about, for instance, British society? Because I think that even for the Western countries, the fact that Russia is still an empire, and has all these imperial ambitions has become a surprise. I mean, this acknowledgement. And I'm just, again, wondering how this intellectual fed, is working, because it was so obvious long time before about Russian imperial ambitions with what they did in Georgia and prior to that in Chechnya, etc., etc. But only now it seems like everyone is ready to acknowledge this. And prior to February 24, the person who would say that Russia is empire would have been called a marginal, it would not be perceived. But now it's come so common. It's a commonplace. If you say that Russia is empire, it's okay. But I mean, how it resonates in British society? Is it percepted, given also, this colonial past, imperial past of the UK, which, I mean, I believe that it's far behind, and but still, what are the sentiments when you say that Russia?
Yeah. It's interesting because, there's as I'm sure you know, a big movement of sort of reassessing colonialism and saying that it was all bad, that changing the names of lots of buildings because people whose names were on them were involved in the slave trade or said things which were supportive of it, and giving things back that were looted from countries. And And that's all, much of that I agree with. Some of it I think is exaggerated. And, there are certain people, my son's at Edinburgh University, one of their most famous students was David Hume, the philosopher. So the philosophy building was David Hume Tower. That has had to be changed, not because he personally was involved in colonialism or having slaves, but a comment that he made in a footnote, or a minor thing. So I think some of it has gone too far. Personally, I wouldn't take all the statues down. I would have plaques that actually explain to people what those people had done. Because if you just take them down, then people don't know at all. It's better that I think that they're informed. But it is interesting because I think in all this anti-colonial kind of movement that there is now, it's just assuming colonialism as something Western and not looking at, the Ottoman Empire or the Russian Empire and what Putin is doing. And as you say, he's very clearly trying to recreate imperial Russia. And a lot of this is sort of fed by his resentment that he doesn't think that Russia is treated as the great power that it should be. So, yeah, I do think that there is an interesting contradiction there.
But also, I think that it's interesting to highlight also the issue of women in the war, something that has been a focus of your books and of your research. Probably you've also researched it while reporting from Ukraine, and I should say that previously it wasn't so obvious and so awful. So there were some cases of rape, of sexual violence, but it wasn't to such extent. So
yeah, well, there were cases in the East, weren't there? But it wasn't discussed as much. So, I mean, I've written a lot about rape in war, and to be honest, I used to really struggle to get anything in my newspaper. I had a older male foreign editor who literally said to me, "No one's interested in this. Nobody wants to read about this in their, over their breakfast cereal." And I found that ridiculous. I think our job is to report uncomfortable truths and, make people think about things and hopefully mobilize people to try and do something about it. So I had been in 2014, I was reporting on what happened to the Yazidis who were taken by Islamic State fighters in Iraq into Syria and literally kept as sex slaves by them and traded one to another. I met one girl who'd been traded 12 times between fighters. She told me she felt like a goat. Absolutely horrific stories. And what was interesting, many of those girls escaped, although some of them are still missing. And they told their stories. Now, these are really difficult stories to tell, right? It's really, the worst possible thing that can happen to you in a way as a woman. And they spoke about them, but then nothing happened. And I think personally, one of the things I find hardest as a journalist is, now we stay in touch with almost everyone we interview through WhatsApp in a way that we didn't when I started out. And, to get a message from somebody who's told you this awful, recounted this awful story of what happened, and then they message you saying, "I told my story. What difference did it make?" And, that's a really hard question. And so I started to think about that more, because I kind of thought my job was just to put out there that these things were happening and then other people would do something about it. But then I looked into, why wasn't anyone doing anything about it? And then I was also, around the same time, I was going to Nigeria a lot. You might remember the Chibok girls that were abducted in also 2014 by Boko Haram fighters in the middle of the night, more than 200 schoolgirls. And so I was going to northeast Nigeria, talking to people there, and found that was just the tip of the iceberg, that tens of thousands of girls had been abducted. And again, they were telling their stories when they got out, but nothing was happening. And in 2017, I was in Bangladesh when the Rohingya people were fleeing Myanmar or Burma, as Burmese soldiers and Buddhist militias were coming into their villages, setting fire to the huts, dragging out the women, tying them to banana trees and gang raping them in front of their children. Again, huge numbers of people. This was happening to tens of thousands of women. And they were talking about it. And again, nothing happened. So I started to become really angry about this. And initially just wanted to know why no one was doing anything. I mean, rape in war is a war crime. Why was nobody doing anything about it? How come the International Criminal Court in 20 years of existence had only brought to justice one person for this, when it was, you were talking about in that period, hundreds of thousands of women it happening to. So because of that, I started, researching it, looking into it, and collecting stories from women in many conflict zones. And, it really, I could have spent the rest of my life doing this because it's happening in so many places. And of course I looked at the history, and one of the things I looked at was what had happened in Berlin during the liberation at the end of the Second World War, and how the Russian fighters had gone in during the liberation of Berlin and raped many of the women. And people didn't talk about it afterwards, because rape, as we know, is the one crime where the victim is often made to feel that they've done something wrong. And so the women felt ashamed. A lot of women committed suicide. And so it's only in recent years, really, the extent of that has come out. Anthony Beaver, in his book on Berlin, it talks about more than 2 million women being raped by the Russians. So it's really, unbelievable numbers. So when last year, after the invasion of Ukraine, I started hearing from some of the women activists in Ukraine that I'd been in touch with, that it was happening in Ukraine as well. Initially, to be completely honest, I couldn't believe it. I thought, surely, in 2022, the Russians are not doing this same thing again. But sadly, as Russians were driven out of places like Irpin and Bucha, and we could go in and talk to people and hear the stories. So I was there, I think, in April and May. And, some of the stories that people were telling were just unbelievable. And it's one of the things I found writing the book about rape in war was, how you can't quite get your head around what enjoyment do men get from raping terrified women and girls in these situations. And, also, was this being used, and I think we still don't really know this in Ukraine's case, is this like a deliberate policy of the Russians? Is it being used almost as a weapon of war? Or is it just the sort of indiscipline of the soldiers that they've sent, the kind of people, because they're also using convicts, and that people are demoralized because the war's not going well, and so somehow want revenge, want to lash out, have been told that Ukrainians are somehow, not human almost. I think we still don't know, what, and we may never know, because actually during the liberation of Berlin, the Russians, nobody ever really kind of uncovered commands saying that people had been told to do this, but it happened on such a scale that at the very least they were turning a blind eye to it.
And yes, while you were talking about those events in Berlin, I think that one of the reasons, I understand that we should finish in the nearest several minutes, but I think it's very important also to underline that, of course, this type of crimes are very complicated, and there should be some time that have to pass prior that people are ready to talk. But nevertheless, I think it also has to do with the fact that people did not want to talk about it because Russia was perceived as the power who overcame Hitler, right? So, and it was not kind of good to talk about crimes of Stalin, crimes of Soviet regime, and it was really unfair, and now that's why now you have all this also process of acknowledgement of various parliaments that hunger in Ukraine was a genocide, that Holodomor was a genocide.
Yeah.
And that is so important for Ukraine now. It's not something that was at that time and everyone forgot. It's kind of, it comes in one basket. The current crimes of Russia and former crimes of the Soviet Empire.
I think, one of the things that I learned right from the beginning as a journalist going out to cover the war in Afghanistan, that war was portrayed very much black and white, like the Afghan Mujahideen was sort of these brave, like a David and Goliath kind of thing, that these were these brave fighters from the mountains taking on the most powerful army on earth. And then, in fact, when you got there, wars are always shades of grey. There are bad things happening on both sides usually. And in that case, some of the things the Afghan Mujahideen were doing were really horrendous. And a lot of people were also, there was a lot of corruption. A lot of the arms were being siphoned off and going to Iran. So, things are never as black and white as they might be sometimes portrayed from the outside. But I do think, because I feel very strongly about this issue of rape in war, one of the positives, if you could say that, about Ukraine is that there's been a lot of reporting on it, unlike other conflicts. It's been reported everywhere. And, there does seem to be a real intent, both by your government, your president has spoken about it, but also by the international community to actually do something, not to just kind of, let it go in the way that it has. So it may be that this war is a sort of turning point on this issue that actually, but it's going to be difficult. It's not easy to bring people to justice for this, definitely. It's hard to collect evidence. It's hard for women. I'm not sure how many women in Ukraine have actually come forward to actually want to prosecute, because people were worried about how they will be seen in their community. And sadly, they've done nothing wrong. Something wrong has been done to them. They should be seen as heroes just as much as the people fighting in the trenches. But people don't always see it that way.
Yes, that's a huge challenge.
So true.
A crash test for the international court institutions.
I think that's a long way. That's a very long way. Thank you so much for this conversation, for pointing out all those nuances on Crimea, which are difficult to learn without having the general context. I'm really glad Christina asked such a lot of clarifying questions, which allow our viewers to deepen their knowledge. We have plenty of questions, but I will just pick a few for you. And there also was a big good feedback on opening the discussion about global south and all the communication challenges which are coming in with this discussion. And there are numbers of important points you raised, and about how people resilience and how most people just carrying on, about those balances, how to find it. But here is one question which I would like to ask you, Christina, picked from all those about colonization and decolonization. One of our viewers asked if you have ever seen a successful case of decolonization and how does it work? I know that's tricky. This is why I picked it.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I just came from Africa. There are many countries in Africa that, are successful. And it's easy to sort of pick on ones where things have gone wrong. But I think you also have to bear in mind that, a lot of these countries are democracies in their infancy. It takes a long time to establish, institutions and for people to really, I feel that quite strongly. It's not quite the same, but I've covered some of the wars where dictators have been toppled. So, for example, Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi in Libya. And you cannot expect people that have spent decades under dictatorship to sort of overnight know how to operate a democracy, how a free press, and all of the things that we are used to. You in Ukraine, you know what it's like to come out from under the Soviet Union and the difficulties of. You don't overnight know how to deal with the freedom that you suddenly have, and some people use it for wrong purposes. So I think we must bear all of that in mind. But yeah, countries that, Ghana, for example, is a country that is, I think, doing very well now. Gambia, there are many African countries. Nigeria, you could pick things that are going wrong as well, but there's plenty of things going wrong in the UK at the moment too. We had 3 prime ministers over the last year and 5 chancellors, and almost everybody seems to be on strike at the moment. So I'm not sure we're a great model for anybody.
And thank you for answering it. That was tricky, I know, but probably will find some inspiration in your answers. And the second question is to both of you: how to find the proper messages and proper communication style to speak about things people don't want to hear?
Well, as a journalist, as I said earlier, I spent a lot of time writing about things people don't want to hear. I think that's my job. And the challenge for us really is to find a way to get people interested. So, telling stories through people, trying to find constructive stories. My book on rape in war is a difficult book to read. I know that. But, there are quite a lot of heroes in that book. There are people who are doing something about it. Again, going back to my point right at the beginning about ordinary people that become heroes. One of the people is a beekeeper who, very humble man who ended up rescuing more than 200 Yazidi girls from Islamic State, just because he, as a beekeeper, said that he saw that the queen bee organized a very effective society of bees, and it made him start thinking about women's rights and why in his society women were expected just to be quiet and not have opinions. So because of that, he ended up risking his life to rescue a lot of people. So it's a sort of challenge, and it will be when I come back again, and I think it will get more challenging too as the war goes on, to find ways, people to tell the stories through, ways to make people who are far away and often much more interested in what their neighbors are doing, to actually kind of identify with those stories and care about them and think that it matters.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and that's an experience of my human rights activism, that there's no way you can engage people and kind of force them politely to take some decisions other than just to make them familiar with the stories, with the stories of people. And that's what makes me to be sure absolutely that we're on the right side of the story with Crimea, just because when you get to know those stories of, for instance, Crimean Tatar people who are persecuted, and Crimean Tatar people just generally as people, as indigenous people, you can not keep the other side or change the side. So I think that's the best way of telling the uncomfortable stories, just to show people and their lives.
Thank you. I think that one of the biggest opening people didn't want to, that neither time, so being in 21st century, and neither place, Ukraine being in Europe in territory, right, save you from this part of, I don't know, animal part of human nature, which we just discussing. That was probably one of the scariest things people had opened for themselves.
You think, oh, this is so terrible, we can't do anything. But actually, one person, you might think you're not doing much, but one person can actually make a lot of difference. And, that, again, to go back to what Malala says, one girl, one book, one pen, one teacher can change the world. And I think that, really is the case.
And also get angry and get intellectually courageous, because I think that what maybe lots of even intellectual lacked in the developed world is the acknowledgement, particularly about Russia, of what was happening with that country. And many people choose just not to notice that, that was also uncomfortable truth of that we have that very dangerous stuff going on in the eastern part of Europe. And it was more convenient not to notice that. That's why, being courageous, it's also, to call a spade, to call things with their names. And I think that the story with this full-scale invasion, that's one of the lessons from this story.
Their genuine perspective of the reality and your own responsibility about it. And remember that one can make a difference. And this all would not be possible without the support of our partners. I should mention the US Embassy in Ukraine, Pan America, the Ukrainian Institute, the Ukrainian Institute London, Ukraine World, Local History, Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, and the Harman Institute at Columbia University. And the gratitude, of course, to Pan Ukraine, which continues to stand at the front lines in the name of freedom and truth. Pan International is proud to be a platform that supports freedom of expression. And thank you again, our great speakers. That was pure pleasure and great privilege, and our dear viewers. And please stay with us next Friday and put your attention, because the time is not usual. It's going to be 12:30 UK, 2:30 Kyiv time. And next week, we are going to host Oksana Utsishina, Ukrainian writer, translator, and academic, and Arundhati Roy, incredible journalist and women's rights fighter. So stay with us, support our dialogues on war, share the stories, human stories, as both of our speakers said, and remember, this is our shared responsibility today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hope to see you in Kyiv.
Yes, sure. We're waiting for you in the office of the Crimea platform. Please come. And thank you for covering Ukraine and uncovering the truth about the war in Ukraine.
Thank you for what you do.